Good morning, or whatever time it happens to be where you are. My name is Argo Vermeer, and welcome to my channel. I thank you to anybody who's listening. Here on this channel, what I do is I like to examine the metaphysics, the metaphysical assumptions which underwrite everything humanity does. So in other words, the basic, most fundamental, usually implicit assumptions about the nature of man, reality, and where these things come from, which fundamentally underwrite all of man's ideas, institutions, philosophies, schools of thought, politics, etc. So, that's what I do here. I examine the rational consistency of the implicit metaphysical assumptions which underwrite everything man does. This is a re-upload of the last video. I really ought to spend some time listening before I upload. Sometimes I forget to do that. I just upload the video. And so when I went back to listen to this, the first time I uploaded it, it was an absolute mess. There was a scratching, constant scratching background noise, which is the effect of where I put the phone, obviously, which I can't detect when I'm speaking, but when I listen back, because the noise is coming from a place so absolutely close to the microphone, it overwhelms what I'm saying. It's so loud. So, and it just was a little bit more scatterbrained, and I thought I could do it justice. I thought I could do it better justice if I went back and re-recorded it. So that's what I'm doing. So this time I came equipped with a few more notes to keep me coherent, cogent, and on a relatively straight and narrow path in terms of my presentation. So this is called The Dangerous Self, and it's the finale. It's part 11, but it's the finale. So we are wrapping up the Dangerous Self series. If you haven't heard the rest of the the uploads in this series, please go back and listen to those so you can get caught up. But the title of today's video, or today's upload, installment of The Dangerous Self, is Richard Dawkins's Whole of Moral Hypocrisy. Now, I'll get to Richard Dawkins more specifically in the end, or at the end of this video, but in quotes, of course. This is really just audio. But it had to do with a brief interview I was listening to, a brief interview of Richard Dawkins. And I've heard, and basically this, one of the tropes that the New Atheist movement likes to pound, one of the ethical tropes that the New Atheist movement likes to pound, is the idea that it's ridiculous to get your morality from the Bible, because if we just look back at the a cursory examination of the Old Testament can reveal all kinds of divine moral atrocity, the mass slaughter of innocent women and children, for example, where God commands the Israelites to go and kill everyone, men, women, and children, and how in the heck can anybody who claims to be a moral religion explain or justify such horrible, heinous, evil action? So not only is there a massive lack of understanding as to what exactly is going on and why this is happening in the Old Testament, what the point is, and not necessarily to any fault of his own or necessarily the fault of the New Atheist movement in general. I mean, I can certainly understand why they would look at that and cry cognitive dissonance or contradiction when criticizing Christians who hold themselves as being, the standard bearers of moral virtue, right? So I get it on the surface, but it just belies a very superficial reading and rendering of the scriptures. And again, it's not necessarily the fault of the New Atheist movement, because basically Christians do the same thing. Christians don't necessarily interpret the Bible with any more depth or any more thought than the New Atheists do. But so there's the basic ignorance of that position, which again is not strictly limited to the New Atheist movement. I mean, you would expect people with the IQs of, say, a Richard Dawkins and a Sam Harris and a Christopher Hitchens to, and then there's another guy too, but I can never remember his name. He must be he's the less important of the four horsemen, because I can only ever remember the three of them. So he must be the boring one. And I've seen his picture, and if you look at him, he looks pretty boring. But the other three are at least more interesting looking. So anyway, he must have, but he's the fourth guy is the one that nobody can remember, or at least I can't. Which, well, of course, more people know him than know me, so joke's on me. Ooh, egg on my face. But there's the basic ignorance. Now, of course, you would expect men with IQs as high as those guys to bring a little bit more depth of thought to their analysis and their ethical critique. But as I've said before, having a high IQ doesn't really make you a thinking man or a thinking woman. It makes you good, I suppose, at a type of thinking. You're good at pattern recognition and memory recall and things like that. But that, being good at pattern recognition and memory recall and having a high ability for sort of abstract rules-based thinking, like mathematical reasoning, does not necessarily make you a thinking man or woman in a truly philosophical sense. The idea that this doesn't necessarily translate into being able to examine an idea or a supposition or presupposition or a position and then tease out all of its conceptual components to see if they actually are consistent from premise to conclusion. So to look at an idea, to find from that idea, to be able to deduce the premise and then to deduce the conclusion of a given idea. And again, the way you do that is you tease out all the concepts which connect together to create this idea. And then you lay them out from premise to conclusion and you see where the contradictions are, or if there are contradictions, and that's how you determine or deduce whether an idea is rational or irrational, where it's going to go, where it came from, why it exists in the first place, etc., etc. So again, I'm not even blaming somebody like Richard Dawkins for not having that ability, because again, to be a scientist, to be a mathematician, to be an evolutionary biologist or a neurologist or whatever other kind of scientist these four horsemen are, doesn't make you a thinking man. That doesn't make them thinking men. It doesn't make them particularly rational, or it doesn't necessarily indicate a high capacity for reasonable or reasoned thinking, which is why they're so bad at philosophy, which is why when people who are great at science start to wade into the realm of the metaphysical, it's like they look like 4-year-olds learning to swim without floaties on their arms. They're just thrashing around. It's clumsy and frankly embarrassing. In scientific determinism, you want to criticize a religion, the Neoplatonic mysticism of scientific determinism, which is the postmodern West new religion, new philosophical zeitgeist. You want to criticize Christianity. You talk about a simplistic, clumsy, cultish religion on its face is scientific determinism. Scientific determinism. They wear their hypocrisy, their ethical hypocrisy, on their sleeve. So the idea that these people criticize any religions which have had thousands of years to at least have had at least thousands of years to really perfect the sophistry, to make them seem convincing. They've really nailed down an apologetic. Now it's, of course, the Christian doctrine in the West is if you tease it out and you examine it closely, it's terrible. The doctrine is entirely contradictory. The metaphysics are horrible. And there's nothing particularly rationally consistent about how Christian or Christ's message is interpreted by the church in the West, but at least it has its sophistry kind of nailed down. The apologetics are there. They have the mantras. They have a liturgy. The new atheist movement has none of that. It's just this clumsy, up is down, left is right, you are but you aren't kind of mysticism that, a kind of new world religion that you'd expect from people who have no capacity for philosophical thought. So, but anyway, so the point I'm getting at with Richard Dawkins is that I can kind of give him a pass on the sort of superficial approach with which the superficial the superficial approach which he brings to bear on his ethical critique of the Old Testament. In the same way I can kind of forgive Christopher Hitchens and Sam Harris and any other new atheist or anybody else who would waggle their finger at Christians, go, how dare you lecture us on morality? Look at what your God did in the Old Testament. How anybody can read that and see anything good in God that's so stupid and so obtuse, and you must all be fools, and it's obviously just a bunch of crazy religious nuts out there. They can't even see the forest for the trees. I mean, God's committing these moral atrocities left and right, and they're just going, this is great, this is wonderful, God is so great, and can't they see the contradict? I can almost forgive them for that overly simplistic and almost embarrassingly simplistic ethical criticism of of Old Testament ethics, but what I can't forgive them for is the hypocrisy. Because if you think that religious moral hypocrisy is bad, and you think moral atrocity committed in the name of God is bad, I submit you haven't seen anything yet. If you understand the ethical implications of scientific determinism, of the neo-atheistic movement, and see the convenient thing about new atheism is they can reject all pretense of having any metaphysics at all, and therefore no fundamental epistemology at all, so they don't really have to appeal to truth necessarily fundamentally, and therefore they are in a position to deny that they have any ethical claims whatsoever. So they have no metaphysics, which means they have no epistemology, because epistemology follows metaphysics. So what is the nature of the real, and what is real, what exists and what doesn't? That gives way to, therefore, knowing what is truth. So metaphysics implies epistemology. Now that we can say what is real and what exists, this is what we can say is true. This is what we can say knowledge consists of. And then from epistemology follows ethics. Ethics is simply going, okay, now that we know what truth is, now that we know knowledge, now that we can define what constitutes real knowledge, now we know how to act. We know how to apply the truth that we now know. So, if you're a new atheist and you are, it's just very politically convenient to call yourself only the facts, ma'am, just the facts. All I want is the scientific facts. Just give me that which I can observe repeatedly, and put into a nice, neat little equation, nice, neat little mathematical equation. I don't really then it's convenient to sit there and go, well, I don't have any implicit metaphysics. Why would I have? Science doesn't necessarily imply any metaphysics and therefore any epistemology or any ethics. But the problem is it does. Because science, in the hands of the new atheist movement and the scientific determinists, who now form God help us, who form the philosophical priest class of our postmodern West, they no longer view science as strictly what it actually is, which is just a methodology man uses to conceptually organize that which he observes, has nothing to do with defining what the nature of anything is, or let alone what man is. I mean, science, in order to be science, has to presuppose the objective existence of the observer, and has to presuppose that science has no fundamental means to describe what the observer is before science can actually exist in the first place. So these Neoplatonists, these scientific determinists, the New Atheist movement, they're evangelicals of the New Atheist movement, and the science priest class, they have turned science into a philosophy. And once you turn it into a philosophy, once science becomes that by which you can describe where everything came from and why it exists and what its purpose is or isn't, or whether there is any such thing as ethical value or morality at all or not, or whether truth is objective or relative. As soon as you decide that science is the means by which you can answer any of these questions, it has become a philosophy. And as soon as it becomes a philosophy, it has an implicit metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics. And what I'm saying is, when that implicit metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics, which we are already starting to see, when the implicit metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics from scientific determinism is brought to bear on humanity, you will see moral atrocity on a scale that you probably couldn't possibly imagine. The hypocrisy of someone like Richard Dawkins, who holds in his head ideas which strip away any pretense of human value, of any moral value, of any existence of a singular individual self. These ideas in his head, the philosophy a man like him holds, strips away not only any value, any moral value, in the complete rejection of the existence of the individual at all, by the categorical rejection of the efficacious and objective existence of consciousness. Not only does it not have even it doesn't have a pretense of that. It strips all of that away. So it's not only that it just has a pretense of that, it doesn't even have a pretense. Scientific determinism will tell you to your face, you don't exist as an individual. Consciousness is an illusion. There is no free will. Ergo, man is a meat puppet. Man has zero legitimate moral value or existential value at all. Man qua man, meaning you qua yourself. There is no soul. There is no spirit. There is no self. You are basically an animal, a talking monkey. Now, what kind of ethics do you think are going to follow from that? Now, he can lie to himself and his followers all day long and claim that he has no ethical stand to make. He's just a scientist. I have no ethical claim to make of my own. I make no appeal to any objective ethics. I'm not saying what you should or shouldn't do, what's right or wrong. I'm just a scientist. He can say that all he wants. He can lie to himself and he can lie to his followers all he wants. That is simply not the case. There are specific, albeit perhaps implicit, and conveniently ignored by the scientific determinist movement, there are implicit ethical consequences for the implicit metaphysics that they hold according to their scientific philosophical worldview. And they are monstrous. You want to talk moral atrocity. You're going to... people like Richard Dawkins, the ideas that he holds in his head, the ideas would strip even the basic pretense of any existence and therefore any moral value to any single human being. You will see moral atrocity. It'll make what God did in the Old Testament look like getting massage, or getting a massage, or it look like a kid's birthday party. You haven't seen anything yet. Once the monsters that will flow out of the implied ethics of scientific determinism are unleashed on the world, and we're already seeing that. You can go out of your house right now and go to. You can't swing a dead cat without running into a government institution that treats you that treats you as an individual as a mere number, as a piece of meat, as cattle. And that's been going on in the state for years, where you go into the DMV, you go to the post office, you are treated like an animal. There's no acknowledgement of anytime you deal with the state, there's no acknowledgement of your individual self-worth. You're a number. You're part of the great unwashed masses. But we're starting to see it even in the private sector. It's like you go to a store, and the stores are designed to herd cattle, not to cater to individual, valuable, moral human beings, individuals who have separate ideas and thoughts and lives that matter. No. More and more frequently, when you go out into the public space, it is designed in ways to herd animals, not to deal with individual people, I submit. So we're already starting to see rumblings of this, but yeah, the hypocrisy of someone like Richard Dawkins, who holds to a philosophy that doesn't even carry a pretense of any moral value to the individual, and completely rejects the idea of a singular self, one's soul or spirit, and reduces him to nothing but the afterthought of some mathematical equation and some biological evolutionary process. A guy like this has the balls to criticize any moral atrocity in the name of justice and truth and right and wrong, whilst compounding the hypocrisy by standing on a position of, I'm just a scientist. I make no metaphysical or epistemological or ethical, certainly not ethical claim. I mean, Hume has proven 200 years ago that you can't get an ought from an is. So who am I to make any? You can't imply any ethical judgments from my positions. I mean, that's all such bullshit. Number one, Hume didn't, because the is ought problem is nonsense. It's a fallacy, and the whole idea of Hume's guillotine, the whole concept is really just a begging of the question, because the whole concept just reduces morality into an ought or a should, which implies relativity. So the very terms in which morality is defined according to Hume's law paints morality as purely intrinsically subjective. So it's begging the question. It presumes morality is already subjective before it makes its argument that you don't get an ought from an is. You see? So the whole Hume's law is ought fallacy. It's just a logic. It in and of itself is a logical fallacy. It's just a begging of the question, because it already presumes something as axiom. So it presumes an axiom that it has not proven yet. That's just bad reasoning. That's just bad philosophy. And, but if that's a little bit complicated, you just think of it this way. If there's no value to truth, there's no truth. So the idea that you can have you can have a description of something, but no means by which the observer can apply that truth of what that is, makes that is irrelevant. Meaning, if you can know something, but there's no way you can objectively apply it, then it's pointless to know it. Your knowledge of it is irrelevant. Meaning, you might as well not know it, because it becomes an irrelevant truth. So it becomes like it's irrelevant knowledge. It's an irrelevant description. It's an irrelevant truth. An irrelevant truth is a purposeless truth. And a purposeless truth is a meaningless truth. And a meaningless truth is a contradiction. So anyway, people like Richard Dawkins, he compounds his hypocrisy, his moral hypocrisy with intellectual hypocrisy by claiming, I don't have any metaphysics. I don't make any ethical value judgments. Well, if you don't make any ethical value judgments, because ethics is corollary to epistemology, is corollary to metaphysics. So you have metaphysics, which is the fundamental philosophical category. From metaphysics, you get epistemology. So metaphysics implies epistemology. Epistemology implies ethics. Ethics implies politics. Politics implies aesthetics. So if you make no claim to holding any objective ethics, well, first of all, you can't then make any ethical value judgment, which means how can you condemn God for doing anything in the Old Testament? So, and maybe I'm simplifying his ethical position. I don't know. I can't really stomach listening to people like Richard Dawkins or Christopher Hitchens or Sam Harris when they wax on about ethics at all, because it's so bad that I just have better things to do. But from what I understand, the idea of scientific determinism, or people who fundamentally root their thinking in scientific objective fact, are the same kind of people who make no appeal to any fundamentally objective ethics. They might pay lip service to some kind of an ethical standard in the name of the common good or some other collectivist trope, but my understanding is that they're not, that if you were to push them on it, they would not be able to identify any objective ethics, any objective right and wrong. It would be more ethics as pragmatic in a narrow sort of subjective sense. So the point is that if you're not appealing to any objective ethics, then you're not going to appeal. So if you make no claim to having any ethics, well, then you can make no claim to having any epistemology, because these are all corollary, right? So if you make no claim to any ethical truth or any ethical propositions, then you have no epistemological proposition either. So you can't make a truth claim. Without making an ethical claim, you can't make a truth claim, which means you can't make a claim about what actually exists. So what in the hell are scientists actually studying? If scientists, by their own philosophy, reject objective ethics, and therefore reject objective epistemology, reject objective knowledge, objective truth, and therefore objective reality, then how in the hell can they perform experimental observations and then deduce anything about the nature of what exists or what exists in the first place? They don't even claim that what they examined is real in the first place, because they can't. Because they're not real philosophers, they're mystics. They're cult leaders. Science is not a philosophy. These men are wonderful, great scientists. They are very good at scientific thinking. They're very good at the methodology and at the pattern recognition and at doing the equations and even creating the equations and discovering new things to observe. They're very good at this. They're terrible philosophers. They have bastardized both philosophy and science in the name, I would argue, of their own arrogance. In thinking that just because you have a high IQ, which means you're very good at pattern recognition and memory recall and certain kinds of reasoning, that somehow this makes you better and smarter and more enlightened than anybody else. I think it's their own arrogance and hubris. So, so instead of Richard Dawkins, no, I wasn't going to say anything more about that, but yeah, so, all right, I think I said everything I can remember to say. But anyway, so Richard Dawkins is going to go rail about the Bible, about the Old Testament. He's going to rail about God's moral atrocity in the Old Testament. He should be going, here, you think that's bad? Hold my beer. That's what he should be saying. He should be saying, oh, you think what God did was a moral atrocity? You think what God did was an abomination? Here, hold my beer. Watch this. Because as soon as scientific determinists like him begin to wield supreme psychological conditioning control, how shall I put it? Once scientific determinism becomes the all-permeating, all-pervasive philosophical framework for humanity, you will see moral atrocity on a scale that will make World War I look like a game of pool. It'll make World War I look like a what am I trying to say? I'll make World War I look like a tickle contest or a pillow fight. So he should really be saying, instead of spending time criticizing Old Testament ethics, he might want to consider examining his own. Or at the very least, if he's going to be honest with himself, he should be going, oh, you think that's bad? Yeah, hold my beer. Watch this. Watch what I do when my ideas get control. When my ideas begin to formulate the fundamental philosophical superstructure of mankind, you'll see moral atrocity on a scale that will make that look like a ride to the circus, you know. Sorry, my metaphors and similes are failing me today. And you know, and just as an aside, because I was going to save this to the end, but clearly I'm going to talk about Richard Dawkins now, which is probably appropriate since that's the title of my upload. But but just an aside, you have to understand that, look, the whole point of this entire series has been really fundamentally examining the difference between individualist and collectivist metaphysics. And now hear me out. Now, collectivist metaphysics imply a collective ideal. The collective ideal is some group identity, some collective identity that all human beings are obligated are all obliged to be a manifestation of. So collectivist metaphysics imply a collective identity that rejects the legitimate existence of the individual self and demands that the masses devote themselves only into the service of the collective ideal. Now, the collective ideal being infinitely subjective and abstract, being anything, could be the party, could be the people, could be the working class, could be the race, could be the church, anything, whatever group identity, because it doesn't matter. It's a transcendent abstract that transcends man's reasoning, so there's no rational explanation for what it is. It just is. So anyway, this collective ideal, because it's entirely transcendent and abstract and has no practical power in and of itself in the world, just as a matter of fact, it needs a physical incarnation. That physical incarnation represents the political ruling class. So the political ruling class exists on behalf of the collective ideal to compel the great unenlightened masses into quote-unquote right thinking and behavior. So the political authority on earth uses violence and threats of violence to dictate truth and behavior to the great unwashed, unenlightened masses, which is you and me. Okay, this is how this works. So every human being in a society which exists under the auspices of a political ruling class, which exists as the physical incarnation of a collective ideal, which all governments are this. There's no such thing as a nation, state, or government which does not represent these collectivist metaphysics. All government is collectivist. Period. Full stop. There is no such thing as an individualist government. Doesn't work that way. So, any individual which exists in a society under the auspices of a political ruling class is, according to the metaphysics which underwrite that society, because it underwrites the state which governs it, and the state is underwritten by the metaphysical collective ideal, every single individual is an expression of that collective identity. There is no individual. So when a nation state acts, there's no such thing as an innocent civilian, is what I'm saying. So when nations go to war, yes, they do try, not so much anymore, but in the old days, they would try to square the circle. They would go, well, let's just go after military targets. So let's just go after the political class. We don't want to target the innocent civilians. But you have to understand that that's a hypocrisy with respect to the metaphysics. I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm saying it's a hypocrisy to the actual metaphysics which underwrite government, because if you examine the metaphysics, there's no such thing as innocent civilians, because everybody that exists under the auspices of that government is to be an extension of the collective ideal, which is therefore, by logical extension, an extension of the political ruling class, and an extension of everything the political ruling class is in charge of, which of course would be the military. So there's no innocent person. There's no innocent civilian. Now, I would submit that over the last 200 years or so, when nations go to war, they have no problem targeting civilians at all. They might pay lip service in the interest of political propaganda to being the benevolent country that's not targeting civilians. It's the other guy who's targeting innocent civilians. No, they're all targeting innocent civilians because that's what war is these days. And because they're acting in service, they're acting in a consistent way with the metaphysics which underwrite government. Meaning that if you accept that the state in your nation or that nations represent legitimate institutions, and therefore it is legitimate that all people which these states govern are to be manifestations and expressions of the collective ideal, which the state is the incarnation of, then you will understand there's no such thing as anybody who's innocent, which means everybody's a fair target. See, this is why I'm an individualist, because I realize there's no way to square the circle. You either have individualism, which means you have no government, or you have government, and you have collectivism. There's no way to synthesize collectivism and individualism because they're rooted in entirely mutually exclusive metaphysical premises. So, in other words, now this is going to sound silly, but if you're God, now, the idea, see, we smuggle into the Old Testament the idea that it's all authority and submission, that it's all whatever God says, you do, period. God's in charge. He's always entirely in charge, and he always has the final say, and everything is his fault because the Israelites are just doing what God says. Like, there's no real relationship. The whole of the Bible, Old Testament, New Testament, the sum and substance is authority and submission. God commands and the people act, and that's it. So, if the Israelites were to go and massacre innocent women and children, quote unquote, in a war with another nation state, well then clearly it's God's fault because he commanded this. Now, think of it this way. Now, there is an example where this is not true. The Israelites were begging God for a king. God goes, you don't want a king. Israelites were going, everybody else has a king, why don't we have one? And God's going, well, because you don't need one. I'm trying to explain to you that the way that the nations have been doing things is not exactly the right way to be doing things, which is why I have brought you out of Egypt, and I've made you a chosen people because I want to reveal the truth to the world through you. Because everybody else is not doing it right. And Israel's like, well, no, we want to do it like everybody else is doing it. Now, what does God say? Does God say, no, I'm in charge? I'm in charge and this is just not going to happen? No, he doesn't. He goes, all right, fine. Because God understands that there has to be autonomy. Because conscious individuals have to be able to act out their own free will and choice. They have to be able to act out their consciousness. If from God's position it's all just command and control, then they may as well not be self-aware, which means they might as well not be able to know he's God. So by very virtue of them knowing that he's God presupposes that they have individual consciences, so they have an individual sense of self, and that individual sense of self must be allowed to exist. It can't be subordinated to a fundamental authority and submission political arrangement between them and God, because that nullifies the necessity of having them be consciously aware. They're just automatons at this point. They might as well not even be self-aware. So God goes, okay, fine. So he gives them a king, and of course, predictably, everything goes pear-shaped after that. So if you're God, and you're going, the collectivist metaphysics are what you have chosen. This is what you have chosen to do. Okay, well, if this is what you want, guess what? This is how it has to go. When you go to war with another nation, you got to kill everyone. Because that's what the collectivist metaphysics, which underwrite the idea of a ruling class, like the king, imply. I'm saying this is a way, I'm not saying this is exactly what's happening. I'm not preaching to you what the Bible is really saying. I'm saying that a thinking person might look at the Bible and might examine these Old Testament quote-unquote moral atrocities a little bit more deeper than perhaps a Christopher Hitchens or a Richard Dawkins might. This is what you might do. And you might go, well, if they're demanding to have a king, they're demanding to have a government, and government is rooted in collectivist metaphysics, and God is sort of obligated to allow them to work out their ideas and to see what the consequences of those ideas are, because that's what it means to be a good God, is you don't suppress the self-awareness of the people. You allow them to, that's their nature. Their nature is to be self-aware. So a good God, a good creator, would allow them to operate from the frame of reference of their individual conscious selves, and then show them what consequences are and aren't based on the ideas that they hold. So they have chosen these ideas. They have chosen this political arrangement, which has behind it certain metaphysical implications. And one of those implications is that if you go into battle with another nation, there's no such thing as an innocent civilian. So if you really want to defeat your enemy, you have to kill everybody. There is no defeating your enemy from the collectivist metaphysical sense unless you murder all of them. You have to annihilate the whole of the people. So what man is supposed to do is go, oh, wait a minute. Maybe I didn't think this through. There are actual, real metaphysical premises behind this thinking. Excuse me for my throat. And real ethical implications. So I'm saying that if God is in a position, excuse me, sorry about this. If God is in a position of rank, command, and control, if God is not, as we presuppose, in a position of rank, command, and control, but is rather in a position to be encouraging the people to indulge their actual nature, which he has created in them, then clearly they are going to reap consequences and be forced to do things that might turn out to be not great, is what I'm saying. So it's only when you presuppose that God represents the supreme command and control authority, and is not actually trying to teach the Israelites anything, is not actually trying to have some kind of a relationship with them rather than simply dictate to them truth and behavior. Then you might be in a position to go, oh my God, I can't believe God did that. I mean, how could this be possible? God's supposed to be benign and benevolent. Well, is it really kind and benevolent to never allow human beings to actually think for themselves and act for themselves and perhaps engage in the moral consequences of their choices? I don't think that's benevolent. So if you're God and you're going to go, all right, well, if this is what you want, I guess I'll give it to you, and then this is what happens. That to me is more benevolent than just simply this God that just commands and controls everything. and is in charge of everything, and contradicts human choice and consciousness and free will for his own selfish purposes. So yes, God, in his infinite wisdom, allowed the Israelites to act in certain ways, and even perhaps commanded them to act in ways that their own chosen metaphysics implied, with, again, the ethical outcomes which would correspond to that. So that's just a way, I would argue, that you could interpret what happened, as opposed to strictly just looking at it, reading it once and going, oh my God, look at the moral hypocrisy. How dare Christians lecture us on how to be good people? Look at what their God did. And so, in part of my argument for as to why God does not represent this sort of command and control, supreme authority, and it's all about authority and submission, is like, why would God then allow a king? Wouldn't God consider a king to be a threat to his own political authority? What political authority on earth do you think would go, yeah, I'll just step aside and let somebody else come in and rule in my stead? Sure, why not? Yeah, I'll just let it happen. You know what? All of us have decided we're just going to abdicate our political power and all of the wealth and all of the respect and admiration that comes with it, and all of the privilege that comes with it. We're just going to step aside, let someone else take over. Sure, why not? What kind of ruling authority does that? Like, if God is really the supreme ruling political authority, then there's no way that he could ever rationally be like, yeah, sure, have a king. Yeah, sure, I'll put a king in charge that you have to obey. I mean, even if you could say, well, the king has to obey God, so if they obey the king, they're obeying God, why would God put a middleman in there? Why wouldn't God just be like, you know what, I'm not going to complicate this. No, just bow down to me and do what I say. And if you ask for a king again, I'm going to smite you. No, what did God do? God goes, oh, you want a king? All right. I'll give you this other political authority that you have to defer to, and then we'll see what happens. So anyhow, that's one way you could interpret that. That happens to be a way that I would interpret it. So, as opposed to simply just seeing, oh, contradiction alert, as opposed to just sort of reading contradiction into it, which is a very superficial way of interpreting the Old Testament, by the way, I might examine it a little bit more and go, well, maybe it only looks contradictory on its face. Maybe there's an ethical problem here only on its face. Let's take a little bit more of a thinking man's view of what might be going on here. And so this is some conclusion I might draw. It's like, well, if the Israelites are bound and determined to act as though they are a nation state with an incarnate political ruling class, and therefore are going to concede to the underlying collectivist metaphysics, then yes, that would dictate that in order for them to win a war against a rival nation state, they would have to consider no civilian to be innocent, and therefore everyone must die. To win a war in the collectivist sense is to kill everyone who does not represent a manifestation of your particular collective ideal. That's how it goes. And surprise, surprise, this is what we see in the Old Testament. So is the Old Testament really morally hypocritical, or is it perhaps morally consistent? If you examine what God is actually trying to do there. You see, it's a little bit more interesting and more complicated than someone like Richard Dawkins might have you believe. But like everything else, for these weak philosophers, they're not really interested in truth. They're interested in anything they can to use as a bludgeon to pound you into submitting to their particular weak philosophical point of view. It's all about winning the argument for them. It's not about truth at all. So if they can take this ostensible biblical contradiction and pound you over the head with it because they think that will win them points in the debate, they'll do that. They don't think any deeply beyond it than that. The only thing that these people know how to think deeply about are the mathematics, because that's what they're good at. They're not deep philosophical thinkers. They're not diving into history to really examine what goes on. They have a presupposed interpretive lens by which they view all of history, and then they use bits and pieces of it to bludgeon the opposition with, just like most people do. So yeah, that's my criticism of Dawkins in that. So anyway, let me just wrap this up. I'm going to finish up. I have a few notes, and I'm going to wrap this up. I'll just read these through because I want to get this done today. All right, so I won't get to Richard Dawkins later because I've already dealt with him now. So we're talking about why the self is so dangerous, why the argument for the objective existence of the legitimate individual self, the idea that you qua you, me qua me, the individual qua the individual, not only objectively exists, but as a metaphysical proposition, which means the conscious observer is necessary for reality to even exist in the first place. Again, I have said this before, this is not an argument for solipsism. I'm not saying that the individual is the metaphysical primary. I'm not saying that I'm God or you're God. I'm simply saying that the individual is a metaphysical proposition and therefore is a component of reality qua reality. That if you take the conscious observer out of reality, you don't have a reality. Nothing can actually exist objectively, actually, and truthfully without the presence of the conscious observer, period. It doesn't make him the metaphysical primary. It just simply makes him an integral component of reality itself. Meaning that reality, if you want to look at reality as a plurality, well, reality is comprised of certain parts. I'm not going to get into the metaphysics of individualism right now, but reality is comprised of parts, and all these parts matter. If you take something which is real and you make it unreal, then it drags the rest of reality down with it. So as soon as you make the conscious observer non-existent, then you have no frame of reference for anything which exists or is real. Again, this doesn't necessarily make him the metaphysical, in fact, it doesn't make him the metaphysical primary, but it does make the individual conscious observer a fundamentally necessary, objectively necessary component to reality. There is no reality without the observer, period. He is metaphysical, and he is objectively metaphysical. So, the argument for in service to the objective existence of the individual self is a threat, the most dangerous thing in the world, because it threatens the institutions and power structures of everyone who's basically in charge of running the world right now. So, which means governments and those who profit from them, and those who those who profit from them, and those who inform them and uphold them and finance them. This is not a dog whistle. I'm not making a dog whistle for any specific people. I'm saying the people that run the world, the government, the political ruling classes, and those who profit from them and bring profit to them so that they can continue to govern and rule. The intellectual argument for the existence of the objective individual conscious self is a massive threat because it undermines, metaphysically, epistemologically, and ethically, all of them. All of the people who are in positions of political power and all those who profit from them and finance them. It undermines the metaphysics, epistemology, and ethical substrate of their entire position, which means it nullifies them as being anything actually legitimate. And that matters. And that's why you're dangerous. That's why to prove the existence of the self is dangerous, and which is why scientific determinism and new atheism has gotten such traction in the public zeitgeist over the last few years, because it, like every other Gnostic, mystic, cult-like religion, it unabashedly and categorically affirms the existence of the political ruling class. So the political ruling class has no problem with religions that affirm its right to exist as it exists now. It's why the new atheist will get 1 million views on YouTube and I will get none. Because my ideas represent an actual threat to the status quo. And the new atheist movement represents certainly the continuation, promotion, or propagation of the status quo. So, yeah, that's part of why I'll never go anywhere on YouTube. There's other reasons for that, obviously, but... So, blah, blah, blah. Anything I want to talk about here? I think I've wrapped this up. And I'm getting tired. I have stuff to read here, but I don't really feel like reading it. I have really stuff that I really want to do. All right, I'll give 5 more minutes. I'll just read here. Okay, the objective and objectively rational, the rationally consistent, conceptually consistent argument for the existence of the individual conscious self, at the root metaphysical level represents the greatest threat to those who run the world and those who influence and profit from those who govern the masses. So the individual, the you and the I, which are governed, we pose no threat to the power of the ruling class, meaning that we possess no physical means of threatening the political authority. Not that I'm advocating that. I'm a voluntarist. Well, actually, I'm a cooperativist, which means I'm a pacifist by nature. I don't mean not in terms of self-defense. Obviously, I support the right of the individual to protect life and property, because that's an ethical obligation. But what I'm not doing is I'm not advocating just a large-scale violence to any political end at all. I'm simply stating the fact that in terms of, you have to think when you're trying to undermine the status quo because you understand that it's illegitimate. You understand that the concept of a political ruling elite is an illegitimate concept because it's based on a metaphysical lie. You have to understand that that's where the real threat is. It's that argument. It's the disproving of the metaphysics which underwrite the positions of political power. Physical power is not a threat because you have none. And the masses really have never had any physical power. For obvious reasons I won't get into, but not only are the masses basically conditioned and propagandized from birth, which makes it very difficult for them to ever think in a way that would fundamentally challenge the metaphysical status quo, which means the political status quo. But they basically existed at the behest and the whim of the political ruling authority because the political ruling authority basically controls everything, or at the very least holds the implicit right to control everything. And the political authority has always, almost always for the most part, wielded supreme, the means of, has basically held a monopoly on force. Means the political ruling authority, what makes them the political rule authority in the most practical sense is that they have the greatest means of violence at their disposal. They always possess the greatest means of physical violence. So they always have a monopoly on force with respect to the people. That's what makes them the ruling class, because they're smart enough to know that that's really what, it's not about the ideas, it's not about liberty and freedom and people voting for them. It's about their ability to use violence to compel the masses to do what they want. That's really the functional means by which they govern, honestly. And if they were being honest with themselves, which is why dictatorships and autocracies are more honest, because they're just like, look, do what we say or we'll kill you. Which is really the basis for any political ruling elite. Do what we say or we'll kill you. But it's easier and cheaper and more profitable to govern a pacified cattle or pacified livestock rather than to try to govern one who's angry and pissed off and ready to stampede at any minute. So in the West, we've used the bromide of democracy and representative government to make it easier to command and control the masses. But at the root of it all, we all understand it's all just violence. They have the means of superior violence, and that's why they're in charge. So, all right. So the ruling class is not threatened by the masses in terms of power. And again, I'm not advocating that the masses should use power because, again, like I said, I'm nonviolent. I think that's wrong. I've always encouraged anybody who's listening, which there really isn't anybody, but I've always encouraged anybody who might be listening to be a law-abiding, peaceful citizen. And that's what I advocate now. There are better ways to make changes, and the better way is really to make the intellectual argument, because that's where the real threat is. The threat is not in power. The threat is in the truth. The truth is really where the threat is. They are threatened by the truth. They're not threatened by the power of the masses. They are threatened by the truth. They are threatened by the idea of the masses being able to speak freely, which is why they're trying to stop it. Which is why when COVID came around, that's when all of a sudden the whole ball got rolling on, we have to combat disinformation. This is all just code for revoking the masses' ability to speak, because they understand that the truth has power and that the masses aren't as stupid as they think. And if they let the masses speak freely, then the truth will get out there, and the truth really threatens. That's where the real threat is. So the history of the nation states is more generally observed to be one of mass compliance with the ruling class, the politicians' leadership of sort of deferential submission. More of humanity has perished by their compliance and obedience to the political authorities rather than resisting it, I would submit. So, and I would say even in instances where people have resisted their political ruling elite, they're always doing it in service to some other rival political ruling elite. That's meaning that they either want to set up their own separate nation state or they want to install their own political leadership. So it's not like the masses are ever vying to separate from government so that they can create this sort of cooperative utopia, which I would want. For me, it's like, for me, it's exchanging one government for the next is always a lateral move. Ultimately, to exchange one political ruling class for another is just a lateral move. They all function from the same metaphysics. I mean, for a short time, it may be more bearable, but it won't last. We're finding that out in the United States. It's been a long time since anybody in this country has ever felt actually free. It's been, I'd probably say, hundreds of years. Maybe even never, if you count the existence of chattel slavery. Has anyone ever, have the people ever truly felt free in the United States? I just don't believe so. There's always a significant number of people at any given moment in this country who simply cannot possibly be feeling free. Whether it's the poor, whether it's the enslaved, whether it's the Native Americans being, genocided, out of existence. I mean, come on. The idea of America being a free country is laughable. Name one moment in time where anybody at any given moment could say, yeah, I truly feel free. It's a laughable exercise. Blah, blah, blah. All right, I think I've said everything. I wrote a bunch of stuff down, but I'm really running out of steam. I'm not sure I really want to talk about it. All right, so, yeah, I feel like I'm doing you a disservice not reading it. I may do an addendum. I'm going to call this the end of this series, but I feel like I'm doing a disservice to you by not reading these last few pages because I do think there's some good stuff. So I will come back and read them. I'll do them maybe as an addendum later. But for now, I think that's all I got time for. It's been almost an hour, and that's about all I can do. So I hope you have a great rest of your day. To anyone who's listening, I really appreciate it. I've asked for likes and subscriptions a million times. No one ever really does. So whatever. Subscribe if you want to or don't. Sorry for the noise. You just heard the noise because my hand is near the microphone. I keep doing that. Also, comment sections are closed because for many reasons I close the comments because nobody's commenting anyway. And I think having the comment section open is, I don't think it's psychologically healthy because it makes me think that I'm doing something here that I'm not doing, meaning that I understand that what this channel is really something I do for fun and for posterity. That this channel, in the sense that you might think of it as a channel and I might think of it as a channel, doesn't really exist. I have really no subscribers and no one's really listening. So there's no real reason to have comments open because if the comments are open, then I keep checking to see if there's comments and then there are no comments. But the act of me checking to see if there are comments is me indulging an idea that this somehow represents something that it's not. Like a legitimate channel that people are actually listening to and are interested in, which it isn't. I wish it was, but I have to be honest with myself, it isn't. And so what it really is something I do for fun and because I think these ideas are important and belong somewhere in the public sphere and perhaps for posterity for my children or grandchildren. This is not, it's like me doing a scrapbook like old people used to do back in the day. They make a scrapbook so their grandchildren could see what they were up to, 50 years from now. And I've come to the understanding that that's what this is, that this is not getting any traction and it will not. And so there's no reason to have a comment section open because no one's engaging with the channel anyway. And if I know that there's no comment section, then I'm going to be less apt to be checking to see how many views I'm getting and if anybody's commenting. And I'm going to be more apt to operate within the realm of what is really going on with this channel, which is, this is just me scrapbooking for posterity's sake. So I wish it weren't so, but it is. And I'm tired of going to the comments section and finding no comments. I'm just turning them off because I'm tired of smacking myself in the forehead going, why did I check the comments again? Nobody's commenting. There's nobody listening here. And you think I'm doing reverse psychology on you. I'm not doing reverse psychology. This isn't a psychological cope. This is me actually, truly, and honestly really wanting to embrace what's actually going on really with this channel. And so, yeah, if you really have to talk to me or you want to make a comment, you can always go to my blog, unreformingtheology.com. And you are free to comment over there. You might have to sign up for WordPress. I don't think it costs anything. But I imagine if you're willing to go all the way over to the blog site, unreformingtheology.com, don't ask me why I call it that. That's a long story. You're willing to go over there and comment or sign up and then comment, then you must have something really, really interesting and important to say. I imagine that, like most people, when they comment on YouTube videos, 99% of it is just their id. And by the time, 30 seconds after they watch the video, they're no longer interested in commenting. Like their id has kind of petered out and they're no longer really interested in what they were going to comment, which is why anybody that bothers to go over to unreformingtheology.com and make a comment, I will assume has actually something important to say, and I'll answer you there. Because I imagine that most people can't be bothered. Most people don't feel fundamentally deep down that their comments are interesting or important enough to go through the time and trouble to go over to WordPress and comment on my blog. But if you have to get in touch with me and you really want to, comments are open on my blog, and I link all of the videos for my YouTube channel over there. So if you're the 1 in a billion people that actually listens to this and you want to comment, you can do it over there. But all right, that's enough. Hope you guys have a great rest of your week, and I will talk at you later. Thanks for listening. Take care.